helping to support a few of the people that are going to be helping support the event tonight. We have Samantha and Ellie from NatureServe. We also have Katie and Ellie who are joining us from Wild Virginia. And all of these folks are going to be making sure everything goes really smoothly for us tonight. So I'm so glad to have that help. A little bit of housekeeping just to get us started before I introduce our speaker for the evening. So the first thing I want everybody to know is we're not going to be using the chat feature. If that's all right, we'd really like to put all of our questions in the Q&A feature. And that's just so that we can moderate those and get them to our speakers at the end and get all of our questions answered in as much as possible. We also would just try to keep a side chat from running and distracting people from the event tonight. The event will be 1 hour. We're really good about sticking to our time limits here at Wild Virginia. So we probably will not get to everyone's questions, but this is an organization based in Virginia, and they really want to make sure that all of your questions are indeed answered. So at the end, there will be contact information. You can follow up with NatureServe if you didn't get your question answered. And we will do our very, very best in the time that's allowed to get to everyone's questions. I think that's all of the housekeeping I have for now. Did I miss anything? Okay, so now it's my honor to introduce Dr. Healy Hamilton. She's the chief scientist at NatureServe, and which is a biodiversity information network focused on management and conservation of at-risk species and ecosystems. She has graduate degrees from Yale and the University of California, Berkeley, extensive field experience in the tropical forests of Latin America, and she leads a staff with expertise in ecology, zoology, botany, conservation, data science, and information management. Together, they deliver foundational information on the distribution, conservation status, and trends of species and their habitats. She's also a world expert on the taxonomy and evolution of seahorses and their relatives. Dr. Hamilton is an elected executive committee member of the IUCN's U.S. National Committee and honorary fellow of the World Conservation Monitoring Center, a contributor to the IUCN Species Survival Committee for seahorses and pipefish, and a member of the Key Biodiversity Areas Committee. She's recent and past president of the Society for the Conservation GIS, a Switzer Foundation Environmental Leadership Fellow, and a former US Fulbright Scholar. So that is a mouthful, but well earned. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'm going ahead and turn over the talk tonight to Dr. Healy, and there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. So please fill up that Q&A, okay?
That's great. Misty, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It makes me feel really old because I have to have been around a long time to get all of those roles taken care of. So I am just going to pull up share my screen here with everyone and get started on sharing with you a talk tonight about a topic that I know all of you are deeply interested in because you're here supporting Wild Virginia in the webinar series. And we're going to talk about the current and future geography of conservation in Virginia. I mean, we mean a lot of things when we talk about conservation. And so I want to be clear that this conversation is about biodiversity conservation. We're talking about sustaining the diversity of life. So I am going to take a short detour at the beginning to remind us all. I'm sure you all know that biodiversity is important, but I just want to remind us all a little bit about just how much biodiversity matters to the well-being of all humans and communities and in our day-to-day lives. And then share a little bit about the story of NatureServe and why we are dedicated to developing and delivering the science that supports conservation actions. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of that science that we work on and how it is relevant to efforts to conserve Virginia's biodiversity. So I'm sure you're totally aware of this, but we don't often think about food and biodiversity as the same thing, but truly, every calorie that has ever been eaten by every human being in the history of life comes from biodiversity. About half of the 400,000 known plant species have some kind of edible parts. We cultivate around 6,000 of those, and there's 15 plant species that feed about 90% of the world. So food is biodiversity. Can't live without that. And it's not just the individual species that comprise the biodiversity that we depend on, but it's also their interactions that provide services we cannot live without, such as, right, pollination that we get for free from ants and flower flies and moths and bees and birds and mammals. There's been a lot of effort recently to actually quantify, for example, the economic value of nature's pollination services. And the numbers are completely staggering. The best estimates we have is that every single year we receive $200 to $400 billion worth of services from biodiversity for free. So another aspect of the diversity of life that our well-being depends upon. And it's also the basis of medicines that cure our diseases. Nature has spent millions of years coming up with solutions to chemistry problems, and the interaction of species has ended up producing sort of a pharmacopoeia that's way more advanced than what we end up synthesizing in the lab. And about half of the approved drugs during the last 30 years are derived either directly or indirectly from biodiversity. A really cool sort of emerging science based on the diversity of life is called biomimicry. And that sort of shows, it's about how biodiversity shows us ways of solving engineering problems, like how we reduce the resistance of the flow of air or water over surfaces, or how materials can be both light and incredibly strong, such as bones and trees. And I want to, this one little story, this one species is so cool. I just have to share it with you. He's not from Virginia, he's from the Southwest. But this is a beetle that is called the diabolical ironclad beetle, who has, he's engineering inspiration because this beetle can withstand the crushing force of almost 40,000 times its own body weight. And it turns out that it has this really cool solution to this common engineering problem about how the point between two plates of material that join together, that's where it's the weakest. And this beetle has figured out how to create armor that is like interdigitated, it like a puzzle piece. And so the layers can like crackle and separate individually. This is, you know, a secret that's recently been discovered about this relatively obscure beetle. And like, who knows what secrets are undiscovered in Virginia's beetle biodiversity. So biomimicry is a source of inspiration that depends on the diversity of life, right? It's the clothes on our back. It's the sheets on the beds that we're sleeping in, the rugs that we're walking in. It's the wood and the thatch and the paper, the materials that forests provide that we also cannot live without. That's all a gift from the diversity of life. And it's also the ecosystems that are formed by biodiversity interacting with the environment, such as this example of coastal vegetation that's absorbing rising seas or helping to mitigate flooding and saltwater intrusion. It's also the water that is transporting and delivering pure water to us and cycling nutrients that we need to grow our food. We call these ecosystem services, and we depend on them as well. And it comes from a combination of lichens and liverworts and insects and inchworms and shrubs and spiders. We are all dependent on this diversity of life, and we just rarely acknowledge that fully. So now that you've had, you know, just at least a few minutes to appreciate just how dependent we are on the diversity of life, I want to share a little bit about NatureServe and our organization and how we are focused on developing the scientific basis for conservation actions so that this diversity of life can be sustained in perpetuity. So to do that, we're going to go back in time to the birth of a movement. This is a photo that was taken over 50 years ago. It's perhaps the single most influential environmental photograph that has ever been taken. And this photograph inspires this environmental movement that is underway, this awareness of a nation that is seeking clean water and pure air, and to sustain the magnificent natural heritage of wildlife and wild places that makes our nation so prosperous. So 1970, Earth Day, millions of people pour into the streets and they demand the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. Legislation happens because people protest about the deteriorating conditions for the environment and for species. And so when President Nixon signs into law in 1973, the Endangered Species Act, it's a mandate for the federal government to protect and recover species that are at the risk of extinction. But that means we have to know which species in which locations are actually imperiled. And that information was not available at that time. So in the earliest days of the Nature Conservancy, they begin to mobilize the world's first biodiversity information network, recognizing that we have this need to discover and document and understand biological diversity if we're going to be able to protect it and conserve it and actually follow the new legislation such as the Endangered Species Act. So scientists at the Nature Conservancy conceive of this network of natural heritage programs in every state in the country, programs that are designed to answer truly fundamental questions about what species are out there, where they are found, and what their conservation status is. So that is the focus of the NatureServe network. We record and compile and manage and analyze and share the highest quality scientific information about what species and ecosystems are present, where they occur, how they are doing, and what we can do to conserve them. So beginning in 1974, the Nature Conservancy started establishing natural heritage programs, beginning with South Carolina and Mississippi. And every one of those programs is dedicated to this systematic inventory of native species, documenting their distributions and determining their conservation status. The world's first biodiversity information network was formed, and it quickly grew throughout the US and went on to cover every province in Canada. And we also have many partner programs in Latin America as well. And in Virginia, you have one of the strongest programs in the country, right? The Virginia Natural Heritage Program, for over 30 years, their staff have been dedicated to answering those same questions, right? Identifying, protecting, and stewarding the natural heritage of Virginia. So that includes maintaining this statewide database for conservation planning. It includes land protection and the protection of habitats for threatened and endangered species, that very diversity of life that we just talked about, how important it was for all of our well-being. So the work of the Virginia Natural Heritage Program produces the most complete and comprehensive inventory of the location and status of rare plants and animals and natural communities in Virginia. And those biologists help the National Park Service, the US Forest Service, the Department of Defense, state parklands, private landowners. We understand the biodiversity of Virginia because of this effort. So we here at NatureServe wish that all the heritage programs were as strong as Virginia's. Then you can imagine Virginia as one program, and the map I just showed you of the network of programs. So NatureServe is the umbrella of all of those programs. And we aggregate information to be able to tell us, for example, what species are at risk. So in this shows you the results of heritage programs from across the country, and we can combine that same type of data that we just described the Virginia Heritage Program collecting. So when we aggregate information across all of those databases, we can talk about conservation status for thousands of species, and not just the charismatic vertebrates like birds, mammals, and amphibians, but also bees and butterflies. So here we're looking at bar charts that show us the percentage of animals and plants that are either critically imperiled in the red, imperiled in the orange, vulnerable in the yellow, or doing better, apparently secure in the light blue and secure in the dark blue. This is absolutely foundational information for conservation. You can't know what to protect unless you know what is at risk. And it is the collective effort of the NatureServe network that has delivered that information for tens of thousands of species for our country. We give this information away for free on our website called NatureServe Explorer. So you can put in any species, common name or Latin name, you can search for ecosystems, and this is essentially a free online encyclopedia of life that represents public access to the combined databases of all the natural heritage programs in the country, as well as across Canada and much of Latin America. We just redesigned it in 2020, and we're really excited to be able to offer our combined biodiversity information to support decision-making freely available on NatureServe Explorer. From our inception, we have been very rigorous about using technology to be able to manage and analyze and deliver the information that we invest so much in collecting. So we've developed these shared methods for aggregating, for acquiring information about biodiversity, the way that we assess species and ecosystems, and we've been pioneering technological advances in biodiversity data management and analysis since the 1970s. Today, we are at the cutting edge of ecological modeling using cloud computing, using the records that we have of species occurrences, using data that we get from satellites or from airborne instruments, using cloud computing that is working with Microsoft tools or ArcGIS Online tools from Esri, spatial analysis tools. So we are at the cutting edge of ecological modeling to try to answer questions about conservation with that information that comes from all those natural heritage programs and all the decades of effort that they have put into collecting it. So today, NatureServe is essentially a place that uses the power of science, the power of data, the power of technology to make sure that conservation is based on the best available information. We're a non-advocacy organization, so we're out there trying to make sure decisions are made with the best available science, but we don't tell people what decisions they should make. So I want to give you one example of a project that our data and our computational capacity and our network has allowed us to answer, to address. And that is a project called the Map of Biodiversity Importance. So what we were able to do is create very high resolution maps of the distribution of over 2,200 of our nation's most imperiled species. Plant species, pollinator species, aquatic invertebrate species. We were able to, for each one of these species, take the data that we have and the ecological modeling approaches that we've developed and create distribution maps for all of those species, and then analyze them to produce an unprecedented biodiversity hotspot map for our nation. So what you're looking at here in the green are the places that we have already protected, right? These are national parks, they're national forests, and the most protected places in those forests. They're areas that we have set aside nationally for the management of biodiversity as well as for recreation. Outside of those protected areas, you're looking at this color coding where the brighter colors show us where we have unprotected imperiled species. So this is essentially a roadmap to preventing extinctions. And that is one of our highest and best purposes in conservation, since we've just been reminded of how much we value and depend on the diversity of life. So this is essentially a conservation hotspot map for preventing extinction. One way that we've simplified this and expressed it is just to call out at very fine spatial scale areas with high probability of imperiled species that are unprotected. So areas of unprotected biodiversity importance, and that's the yellow areas that you see here. So now I want to switch to zooming into Virginia and being able to look at how do we take these results from this map of biodiversity importance project, which has offered us unprecedented spatial and taxonomic resolution to understand how we can best prevent extinction. And we want to look at it through the lens of efforts that are already underway to conserve the biodiversity and ecosystems of Virginia. So here, we're basically looking at Virginia, we're zooming into the map of biodiversity importance for the state of Virginia. Again, the brighter colors are areas where there is suitable habitat for multiple imperiled species. Crayfishes, mussels, pollinators, plants, birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, freshwater fishes. We're looking at the whole panoply of biodiversity in Virginia that is imperiled. And there are clearly areas of Virginia where multiple imperiled species may be co-occurring. If we want to prevent extinctions, this helps us with some kind of like a roadmap to being able to know geographically, right, spatially, where do we focus those efforts? We can break it down for subsets. So in this case, we're looking at areas that are just about imperiled aquatic invertebrates represented by crayfishes and mussels. So certain stream reaches have the habitat where multiple imperiled aquatic invertebrates can be found. And these are the basis of our food chains in our rivers. If you don't have the mussels, they can't filter the water and keep it clean. If you don't have the crayfish, you don't have things for the fish that are commercially important to us and recreationally important to us and culturally important to us. So we can break this down by plants or by pollinators, and in this case, aquatic invertebrates, and understand what are the stream reaches that we need to focus on keeping protected and healthy if we want aquatic invertebrate biodiversity to be protected in our state. So again, we're going to take that threshold of these areas of unprotected biodiversity importance, right? Places where some imperiled species occur, the habitat for imperiled species occur, and they're falling outside of our current protected area estate. And then we want to look at that in terms of all of the work that's already going on in the state of Virginia that's been developed by the Virginia Natural Heritage Program, by Wild Virginia, by stakeholders such as you all, by other government agencies, because there's been a lot of work and planning on how to conserve the most important wild places in Virginia. So for example, this is the protected areas conservation lands data that includes both public and private areas such as conservation easements that have protection in Virginia. So we have already invested a huge amount in protecting lands in Virginia. And with the data that we just saw, we're able to look at, well, what are those co-benefits for species that are most imperiled in our state? We have a plan for conserving Virginia into the future. And that includes identifying the landscapes that are the most resilient. So here in red, we're looking at the priority areas of land and water that are around existing protected lands and that are important habitats. They're important for climate resilience, important for recreational values. And this is, these are important from many different voices have determined what's important here. The Fish and Wildlife Service, the Virginia Department of Forestry, the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, the National Park Service. We're listening to a lot of different voices when we identify what are this protected landscape resilience spatial data. We also recognize the importance of working lands, right? Agriculture and forestry are absolutely essential to the landscapes of Virginia, and they have a role, not just economically, but also ecologically. So here we have our Conserve Virginia's plan for the Conserve Virginia areas where agriculture and forestry are occurring in the landscape. And you can see how they're part of the matrix. They're part of the solution. And so working lands are critical to our conservation efforts. This is the natural habitat and ecosystem diversity data set from this plan that we have to conserve Virginia. Here we're looking at multiple aspects of conservation value, right? Which areas are important conservation sites, which areas are ecologically core to like where we have relative intactness. We're looking at conservation sites that have been identified by the Virginia Natural Heritage Program and other programs that tell us these are places that are priorities for our most natural habitats and diversity of ecosystems. Then finally, we have of many data sets that are already out there from the plan to conserve Virginia, we have this natural land network that tries to understand what is the matrix of lands that has to be created in order to connect those core areas that are important. So here in the dark green are the core areas, and in the lighter green are smaller cores and the corridors that are necessary to be able to connect them. We in the science community understand that connectivity is one of the most important things that we need to implement on the landscape in order to conserve species and the goods and services that they provide. So we cannot have isolated parks and protected areas that are islands. We have to be able to connect them so that animals can move through a landscape, find food, find mates, find the places that they need to rear and raise their young. So connectivity is absolutely essential. And we have a plan for the future of conservation in Virginia through these data science-based analyses of core areas and the ways that we need to connect them. So summing all of that up, we're going to look at this natural land network data set, right, which includes the cores of all sizes. It includes the corridors, and this is a data set that we're now going to intersect with the map of biodiversity importance and ask of these natural lands that encompass most of the data sets that we just described, that's sort of the fabric of conservation for Virginia's conservation vision. We can now query it in a way and ask, what are the co-benefits for imperiled species derived from the map of biodiversity importance work that we described earlier? So we're intersecting these two data sets now. The white will remain for the next few slides as Conserve Virginia's natural lands network that encompasses a lot of the conservation goals for the state. And we've overlaid that now with the map of biodiversity importance, where again, the brightest colors show us where multiple imperiled species habitat co-occurs. So let's kind of dig in here a little bit more deeply so that we can see those benefits sort of zooming in. This call out box, this little black call out box is, we're going to zoom into a particular area that shows us that the natural lands network actually is falling in an area that is also high probability for multiple imperiled species. So we can sort of help prioritize, help explain the value of some of these corridors in the natural lands network, because we can demonstrate scientifically the co-benefits of being able to prevent certain species from going extinct if we're able to conserve those lands. In this case, there's about 5 different species that are found in these landscapes, including bats and fish and flowers, and so a couple different plants. So we can describe these imperiled species and how we're able to protect them if we can invest in conserving, in implementing this vision of connected lands that Conserve Virginia has developed. This is just one example in one stretch of a corridor of Virginia. Another one we might look at is further in the forested areas. So before we were sort of in the Virginia lowlands, and now we can move into the forest and look at another example of how the map of biodiversity importance, telling us about the location of imperiled species, fits with the natural lands network that is a key part of the plan for conserving the biodiversity of Virginia into the future. So we're zooming in again, and even from here, you can see how much imperiled biodiversity, how much those orange and yellow colors that are showing us where our imperiled species are overlaps with the areas that we most want to protect across Virginia. And if we look at some of those individual areas, here's a whole bunch of imperiled plant species that likely co-occur there. So what we're doing is demonstrating that the conservation vision we have for the future of conserving the biodiversity of Virginia is we're demonstrating that it has co-benefits for imperiled species, that we're successful in capturing a lot of the species that are on the brink of extinction or headed towards decline by being able to implement this conservation vision that has been developed for Virginia. So we can be guided to conserving the right places, and we can help prioritize among those places that need to be conserved in order to, because we can't conserve everywhere all at once. So preventing imperiled species from going extinct becomes part of the goal of implementing the conservation lands network. So here we're looking again at those areas of unprotected biodiversity importance. So for any given species, things that are falling outside our protected area network, we're going to zoom in here to see, again, how are we doing? This is now in another area of Virginia where we're going into the southeast towards the coastal plain. And what we can see here is, again, the white is the natural land network, and the yellow is high probability of the habitat for species that are imperiled. And we see great overlap and opportunities for maybe even adjusting that natural land network to capture even more imperiled species habitat. But it's working. Those conservation, these conservation lands, this natural land network is helping us to identify places where imperiled species occur and need conservation protection. I want to sort of wrap up this section by making sure that we understand again the importance of working lands. So this is agriculture and forestry, and the role that they clearly play in making in sort of the fabric of the natural land network, which again is here in the white. So the working lands in the orange and the natural land network that is part of Conserve Virginia's vision in white. And we can zoom in again to see just how important, sort of just how much of that fabric of a conservation landscape working lands actually are. There's an incredible opportunity in forestry and agriculture to be part of the solution for conservation. And that's something that we can never forget, that we can't think of working lands as other or as unprotected. We need to encourage working lands to be part of that solution. And thinking of both agriculture and forestry as operating in this larger landscape. So here's just an example of sort of landscape biodiversity, right? Biodiversity functioning at a landscape scale. What is it giving us at the scale of a landscape? It's producing the air that we breathe and clean water, but it's also habitat for animals that we hunt. It's also cycling nutrients and giving us rich soil. And then at a landscape scale, it's part of the wood that's our raw material or part of the biomass we're using for energy. We're getting non-forest timber products that we call non-timber forest products such as berries and mushrooms, right? All of these are gifts from the diversity of life that occur when biodiversity can operate at the landscape scale. And so I want to just take a moment to look at Virginia as part of a landscape of biodiversity. So here we're looking in dark green at the forested areas of essentially sort of the mid-Atlantic and going a little bit westward. So the lighter green is sort of shrub and herb vegetation. The darker green is forest and woodland. And we can see how, even though we had all those cookie cutters of data sets from the state of Virginia, Virginia is very much embedded in a matrix of a deeply forested landscape. And we have to think of it in terms of part of this forest ecosystem that continues, of course, into the other states. And that's part of core areas and connectivity. They go to the north of us, the south of us, and the west of us. So we can't think of just Conserve Virginia. We have to think of Virginia as part of this mosaic, in this case of forests. Here's a mosaic of all the different ecosystem types. So this is our the highest resolution map of different ecosystems. There's over 600 in the country, so there's no way to put a legend on this map, but every color represents a different ecosystem type, and the darkest gray are where those ecosystems have been converted to more of a non-natural state. And so again, we see Virginia in this matrix of all kinds of different ecosystems, and thinking about biodiversity conservation at that landscape scale, at that, in this case, mid-Atlantic scale, is something that we can never lose sight of, because biodiversity doesn't care where the border is between Virginia and North Carolina. This is a data set that helps us understand what lands have been developed and so truly developed, as in paved over, and what is sort of non-natural vegetation, which is in the gray. And then what could we still consider natural habitat in the light green? And again, we can see how important connectivity is of Virginia in the context of its neighboring states, in the context of the Appalachian Mountains, in the context of deeply forested landscapes that extend all around the state of Virginia to the north and the south and the west. The Nature Conservancy has done this incredible analysis, helping to define what are the most important lands to maintain connectivity and resilience. And this actual data set is part of the Conserve Virginia blueprint. It's a really important product that's been generated by the Eastern Science Division of the Nature Conservancy. And it's showing us what are the areas that are the most resilient to some of the global changes that we're experiencing. What are areas, those are the lighter greens, the green colors. What are the areas where we know connectivity is important because climate change is going to force species to have to move to follow the temperature and precipitation regimes that define their habitats. So where are the corridors? Where are the flow zones? And so here we're seeing, again, just trying to understand Virginia as part of a larger matrix in the Mid-Atlantic and indeed Eastern Seaboard landscape. And finally, NatureServe has produced a data set of high conservation value forests, right? So we're from lightest green to medium green to darkest green, we're looking at a whole suite of conservation values and trying to identify which are the forests in this region that have the very highest conservation values. And we can see, again, how Virginia is an essential part of this landscape of trying to protect the forests that have the highest ecological integrity, the most biodiversity, offer the most for connectivity across core areas. These are expressions of conservation value that help us guide how we want to protect and conserve the biodiversity of our state and how it fits into conservation efforts in neighboring states. So what can we do, right? What do we do with all this science and all this data? How do we act on being able to protect and conserve Virginia with all of these different maps? So there's amazing reforestation initiatives that are underway. If we want the types of corridors and connectivity that we've described as so important for conserving Virginia's biodiversity, we're going to have to create some of them because they have been lost over time due to human activities. But reforestation is alive and well and active throughout the Appalachia, and it's something that we can get actively involved in. And that now, because of all the science that we've just shown, we know what to do where. Where do we need to be reforesting? We have a plan for that. The future of biodiversity conservation is informed by science and then acted out in part by reforestation. When we reforest, that helps us keep our rivers clean, right? Our watersheds are where our forested watersheds are where we absorb precipitation, we clean out that water and filter it through the soil, and it's delivered into our rivers to be able to keep our rivers clean. And so we want to make sure that those riparian corridors, right, the corridors along our river systems are as vegetated and protected as possible. Our working landscapes it's up to us how we want to work on them, right? There are all kinds of production systems for crops and production systems for plants. This is one that's a demonstration farm for agroforestry, how we can grow trees and crops together, how we can look at heritage plants, heritage crops, right? So we can use locally adapted seeds and maybe experiment a little with crops other than just corn or soy or cotton. We can put conservation buffers on the landscape, right? So we may have a highly modified working landscape that we can then make sure there are edges to that are wildlife friendly, right? Put buffers on the landscape so that, and these have been shown to work through data, through science. It's extraordinary how narrow strips of buffers surrounded by working landscapes still serve for the importance of connectivity conservation. So conservation is place-based, right? We can restore our coastal areas, we can restore our forested areas, we can put buffers in the zones in between our forests and our mountains and our rivers and our coasts. It's up to us to be able to implement actions in any given location that are biodiversity friendly with a minimum sacrifice to sort of the economic productivity that we also demand from our landscapes. So what can you do? Here we have a blueprint for the future of conservation in Virginia. And every single person on this webinar and all of us at NatureServe, certainly all of us at the Virginia Natural Heritage Program, certainly Wild Virginia, we're all working to make this vision happen. So we have a plan. That plan is based in science. It's informed by decades of data, and it's up to each one of us to be able to implement it. So, how can you help? At NatureServe, we have this cool program called Adopt a Species. And these are some of the species that are available for adoption from Virginia. So you can go to natureserve.org adopt to learn more about how to support the creation of the types of information that I shared with you that NatureServe produces. You can support Wild Virginia, right? Which is working to make sure that that conservation vision that we've talked about for the last half hour and that all those maps show get implemented. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Misty to give you a little bit more information about what opportunities there are for you to support the current and future geography of conservation in Virginia. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you so much. I know I was taking a few screenshots there. I'm very excited about using some of the data I saw tonight. So I know we're running low on question time, so I do not want to cut that short. Ellie, are you still with us? Could you take a few questions from the Q&A? I want to make sure we get a chance to answer at least a few before I rattle on.
Yeah, definitely. So we have a few in here, and remember that you guys can contact, I think Katie just put the information in the chat. So definitely contact if you have questions lingering. But our first question is, does NatureServe aggregate data from citizen science, like Monarch Water, Feeder Watch, iNaturalist, for example, or do you guys just aggregate data from state agencies?
So that's a great question because, of course, there's a lot of biodiversity data that are out there that have been collected in efforts other than natural heritage programs. We do work quite a bit with citizen science data, but we tread very carefully there. So one of the beautiful things about data from natural heritage programs is that it is collected in a standardized way by highly trained botanists, zoologists, and ecologists. So we absolutely know that this is the best available observation data about biodiversity. However, there's no way that we can, survey everywhere. And there's incredible amounts of citizen science data that are coming online. We do work closely with iNaturalist, and we've developed mechanisms to be able to harvest the data from iNaturalist and send it through several different levels of filters. And then we use it in analyses, but we use it carefully. So I would say on a project by project basis, we are able to integrate our data with other data sets, including the map of biodiversity importance, which does have data from eBird and iNaturalist included in it. We've also recently published a paper about the process of filtering citizen science data to create biodiversity information that is of sufficient quality for confident decision making.
Awesome. And I think our next question is, does the database on your website have every single animal, plant, or fungi in the world, or what does that contain?
No, it does not. It is essentially, it's a view into aggregated data from the Natural Heritage Program. So it's focused on North America. There's data on ecosystems across the Western Hemisphere, but for the most part, it is about the species in US and Canada, which is really where the core of our Natural Heritage Network lies. But we do have information for almost 100,000 species and ecosystems, but it is not globally comprehensive.
Great. Okay. So the next question is, does the data you integrate into the Natural Land Network allow prioritization of lands based upon the level in which you identified indigenous species are endangered and thus prioritized? Does that make sense?
God, I would love it if someone from the Virginia Natural Heritage Program was here to actually answer that question. So we were not involved in the creation of the Conserve Virginia work. I just wanted to highlight all the work that is going on. So I am sure that imperiled species are part of how the Virginia, all those Virginia lands data sets were created, but I can't speak directly to the extent of prioritization based on imperiled species. But I bet someone from Virginia Natural Heritage Program could if they were here.
Right. All right. And so I think we have time for a few more. How are you validating the actual existence of endangered species in suitable habitats? So kind of similar, but and yeah.
Yeah, so the Map of Biodiversity Importance project has generated essentially hypotheses at high spatial resolution for where there's suitable habitat for over 2,200 imperiled species in the lower 48 states. That project is literally hot off the press. The paper publishing that work is probably coming out next week. So it hasn't even, it's been accepted and it's in press, but it hasn't even been formally released. So we have not yet had a chance to do a lot of validation, but this is the beauty of a national network of natural heritage programs, because these are the biologists that will be able to go into the field and start helping us assess the presence or absence of those imperiled species in the areas where we project suitable habitat. There is one project that we've had in the state of New Mexico where we have been able to validate for about 6 plant species. And for some of those species, we have successfully found new populations of imperiled species using the models to guide the places that we go and do new inventory. So we do have some exciting success stories of how we're able to use the models and validate them, given the expertise of our Heritage Network biologists.
That's really neat. Okay, so one quick question was, how can you see the recorded program? And I think there's an answer to that in the chat. So they'll be sharing it after the event. Okay, and then what else do we have here? Have you identified any threatened fungi? Sorry.
So yes, the Natural Heritage Network there are quite a few fungi that are in NatureServe Explorer, but we did not, the Map of Biodiversity Importance project that I talked about today did not focus on fungi, but that is a group that we do examine. Of course, they're a difficult group to work with, and we haven't comprehensively assessed all of them. But there is a lot of information on the conservation status of fungi on NatureServe Explorer based on the aggregated efforts across the Natural Heritage Network.
Okay, great. Let me see here. Misty, do we have time for any more, or what do you think?
I think we can do one more. I think maybe one or two, and then we'll have to wrap it up. I did notice that folks from the Virginia National Heritage group are here. So if we wanted to, Jason Bullock could actually answer that previous question if you want. I'm going to give you the ability to talk, Jason, no pressure. But could you reread the question, Ellie?
Yeah,
that was
sure.
a question
Okay.
for them. Thanks.
It was the one
yeah.
about prioritizing the lands.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So does the data you integrate into the natural land network allow prioritization of lands based upon the level in which identified indigenous species are endangered and thus prioritized?
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Yes, the natural land network is prioritized and on several criteria, and one of those, or some of those, are rare species we track, our conservation sites, which have a biodiversity ranking of 1 to 5. That's factored in, as well as state and federally listed T&E species, as well as species of greatest conservation need designated by the state Department of Wildlife Resources.
Thank you, Jason. That's the director of the Virginia Natural Heritage Program, sharing his knowledge with you, just to be clear.
Thanks for joining us, Jason. Thanks for popping in. I appreciate it.
Sure, sorry for the technical difficulties there.
No problem. And Ellie, I'll take the last one here. It looks like there's one last question. This is Steve Critchbaum, who actually used to be with Virginia. Hi, Steve. And he's calling out, the question about what protected lands mean, right? Lands and public lands are having a lot of concerns that occur on them, right? We have chainsaws, bulldozers, habitat being simplified, degraded, and destroyed and fragmented, no doubt. So deciding what lands we call protected is a really big question, and one I think we all wrestle with. So would either of you like to speak a little bit to how you've reached the idea of what protected lands are?
Jason, I showed the protected lands network map during the talk, and I wonder if you want to share a little bit about how the data behind that map determined, which areas were protected and which are not.
Well, the Conservation Lands Database for Virginia is managed by the Virginia Natural Heritage Program. We have focused effort on that for a couple of decades. It's fundamental information for doing land conservation, is to know what's already protected, who owns it, who manages it, and what they're managing it for, in order to plan the most strategic next places to protect. So the Conservation Lands Database, which is available, downloadable from our website, and which is the component that is input into a National Conservation Easement Database, as well as the Protected Areas data set of the US. It includes state and federal fee protected lands like parks, national forests, national parks, state parks, local parks, anything that's protected permanently in fee, and easements as well are included there if they are permanent conservation easements.
Thank you, Jason.
I did that. Thank you, Jason. Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up too, Steve, because I think that is a really important question as we move forward and think about, what we're actually trying to do here on the ground in Virginia. So thanks. We are out of time. There are more questions, but as we said, as you see in the chat, you can reach out to folks at NatureServe, ask your questions. They hope that you do. If you have any trouble reaching them, I hope you reach out to me. I'm going to be sending out the recording from this event, as well as ways that you can reach out to both us and NatureServe, and a few maybe next steps that you can take with the information you've seen. We really want you to use the work that NatureServe is creating and be advocates for the places you love alongside all of us. So again, thank you to everyone here at NatureServe. Thank you to everyone that helped make this tonight seamless. This is great. And thanks to everyone that showed up and took the time to learn how to better protect the places we all care about. Have a good night, everyone.